Welcome to another video. This time it will be on the Spanish again, actually. And this time we'll be looking at the sidelines. And after this video, you will almost be ready to have your full Spanish repertoire. So the Spanish goes e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And this time we will be looking not at the Berlin, not at a6, but moves like pawn to f5, d6, bishop c5, and knight to d4. This is a lot of tricky moves, all where white should be doing well, but actually it's always great to have some knowledge of what to do. We'll be starting with the move pawn to d6. The idea being to support the center. You want to protect this e5 pawn. And I played a lot of games with white in such positions, and I would recommend to play pawn to d4. The idea is that now if black takes, we'll take back with the knight, and there is a pin on the black king, and for this reason black should play bishop d7 to avoid losing a pawn after knight takes d6, bishop to d7, and here we'll play knight c3. And right now, one thing going for white is that he has a pawn on e4 compared to black's pawn on d6. At this position, black can play in different ways. One is to play b6, trying to fianchetto the bishop on g7. After this, I recommend to play bishop to e3. Bishop goes to g7 as expected, and now we can play queen to d2. In some lines now, if black plays a move like knight f6, we can now take the knight here. He will probably recapture with the pawn, and then we can play the bishop to h6, trading this very strong bishop on g7, and after that we will be doing great because black has a double pawn and we have great control on the center. For this reason, black has also tried a move like knight takes d4, but this is no good because we can take on d7 with the bishop, queen takes d7, and queen takes d4. Again, doing well because of this e4 pawn and the development. Most black players instead have played a move like knight f6, we will castle, and bishop e7. This is a very solid setup, playing almost symmetrical for black. The knight on f6, knight on c6, bishop on d7 and e7. But white is doing better nonetheless because of the pawn on e4 and the nice placement of the pieces. Rook to e1 is my recommendation. If black now castles, I would simply want to play bishop to f1. And again, we're doing well because of the e4 pawn. The next move for white could be like h3 or bishop to f4. Anyways, doing slightly better here. So after d4, black also has some other options. One could be to play a move like bishop g4, trying to pin the knight. And now if we play a move like d5, which I actually don't recommend, black can play a6, and it's not so clear. This is very typical. White doesn't win a piece because if we play bishop a4, intending now to take the knight next move, black will play b5, and the position is not so clear. Instead, after bishop g4, I would instead recommend to play knight to c3, defending the pawn on e4 for later. And if black now takes the knight on f3, we'll take back with the pawn. If black takes the pawn on d4, we can take with the queen. And because of the pin on the knight on c6, he can now not take the queen. And white is doing better. We have a strong center, and we intend to develop the bishop with a great game. Also, I would here put the king on c1 with long castling. Also, some black players have tried to take the pawn on d4. Then we can take back with the queen. For example, if he plays knight e7, at some point it's always great to get back the queen, so we'll play queen to d3. And again, because of this spatial advantage with the pawn on e4, white is doing supreme. So at this point, also some black players might play a move like bishop d7. This is of course quite passive, but then we can play knight c3. If he takes, it will simply transpose to the line from before. And if he plays a move like knight f6, castling is of course completely fine and a very simple way, but also white can try to take on c6, and if we take back with the bishop, we'll play queen to e2, defending the pawn on e4, and leaving black with some kind of headache that he doesn't know what to do with this e5 pawn. He can't really defend it so easily. If he plays a move like bishop e7, we can simply take the pawn, and we won a pawn, so we're doing great. Or if he takes the pawn on d4, we will take back with the knight. The next move we will play, for example, knight takes c6 or bishop e3. And again, we're doing better because we have prospects to castle long or simply to have a great central advantage. For this reason, I think that d4 is an excellent way to handle d6, and I wouldn't be so scared of that move. Instead, let's take a look at bishop to c5, intending to develop the knight on f6 or e7. Here, I want some more drastic measures, for example, to play pawn to c3, intending now to next move play d4. If black plays a move like f5, playing very aggressively, we'll still play pawn to d4. Now, if he takes on e4, we can actually take the knight. If he takes our knight, we'll take with the bishop. And he still has some problems with the bishop on c5, and also especially the king on e8 is not doing so great here. For example, if he takes on d4, we can take pawn takes d4, and white is doing better here. A similar pattern is showing after pawn takes c6. We can play the nice move knight takes e5, and we have ideas like queen h5 or simply castling the king with a better game. For this reason, some black players after c3 and f5 and d4 could attempt to take this pawn, but then here we have a very nice move playing pawn to e5, and now the black king is in grave danger. A move like pawn takes c3, we can play knight takes c3, and the king is in trouble because the pawn on f5 is simply too far pushed. He would love to push back the pawn to f7, but as we all know, this is not possible in the rules of chess. So f5 is also quite a risky option, so I think that a lot of players instead will try to play knight to f6, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. White can now castle the king. And we should not be afraid of black taking this pawn on e4, because then we can play pawn to d4. If black takes this pawn, we will take back the c pawn, and next move we will play pawn to d5. For example, bishop goes to b6, we can play d5, and the knight probably has to go to e7. And in general, black is having a lot of trouble with especially this bishop on c8. White can play a move like, for example, queen e2, and black is having a problem with his king. For example, if he plays a move like knight d6, white can play bishop d3, and he has a lot of trouble on the king side. I think also if he castles now, he has to look out for ideas like bishop takes h7 even. And if we take knight g5, king goes, for example, to g8, there's always queen h5 coming. He can, of course, try a move like king to g6, but in this situation also white has moved like queen g4, and the king is in grave danger here. I don't know if he can survive, but at least this position is great for white. The bishop is too bad on c8, and it's hard for black to develop here. So for this reason, black can also try to play bishop to e7. but we will play pawn to d5, and the knights are doing terribly on e4 and c6. So some players have instead tried to play bishop to e7 here, but then we can take pawn takes e5, the knight on e4 being in trouble, it doesn't have any stability, and white is doing simply better here. So this was knight takes e4, and white is not such a great idea. Instead, many black players in this position have tried to castle the king. We will continue with our plan of pushing the pawn to d4. Now it's a big mistake for black to take this pawn, because we will recapture, c takes d4, and we have the whole center. Next move, we can play moves like d5 or e5, and the knights will be pushed away from black. So he's in a lot of trouble here. Black players have instead tried to play bishop to b6, and now if we take on e5 for example, black can take knight takes e4, and he's actually not doing so badly because next move he will play pawn to d5, and also he has pressure on f2. So this is not to be recommended. Instead I will suggest to play rook to e1, defending the pawn on e4. If black now plays a move like d6, he actually has a somewhat hidden threat. If he gets the bishop on g4, white's center will simply be very disrupted. Let's say I play a move like a3. He will play bishop g4. Next move looking to take on d4 or take on f3, and white will be in some kind of a trouble. So after d6, I would recommend to stop this idea with the simple move h3, making a prophylactic stop of the bishop g4 move. And white has ideas here of putting the knight on a3 or playing bishop f1. In general, being preferred here. So this was actually bishop c5, where, just to refresh, I want to recommend to play c3 and at some point push d4. After knight f6, we'll first castle and then d4, and white is doing well. So now we looked at d6 and bishop c5. Let's take another look at another special move, knight takes d4. This move would be quite sensible if white had the knight on c3. Let me just show. If this was the position, knight d4 would make much more sense, because now if white takes, black will take back, at least hitting the knight on c3, forcing white to make a move. But as it stands, knight d4, white can simply take this knight, and there is no knight on c3 to worry about. Even after a move like bishop goes to c4, white is doing better here. But I want to recommend to take on d4. Black will take back with the pawn, creating a threat of queen g5, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn. But we will simply stop this with short castling. And here, black has some different ways to play, none of them being so great. But let's look. For example, if he plays a pawn to c6, we will now put the bishop on c4. The bishop is even better standing here than on a4, because we're pressuring the f7 pawn. Let's say black plays a move like d5, we can now take, and if he takes back, we have bishop b5, and black has a double pawn in the center, which will be vulnerable. After bishop c4, black will play knight f6, and here it's very important not to rush things. Like playing e5, black can simply play d5, hitting the bishop. If we take the knight, take the bishop, and the position is quite unclear because black has the bishop pair here. So we will not allow this. Instead we'll play pawn to d3, defending the pawn on e4. Now if black plays a move like d6, we'll play knight to d2, intending to push h3 and knight f3 with a great game. The more ambitious way for black to play is to push pawn d5. Now we will have to take this pawn. Black doesn't want to take back on d5 because of bishop b5 check, again leaving him with this double pawns. Black will instead take knight takes d5, and now we need to make use of the king in the center. If black got some time to castle his king, he would probably be doing more or less okay. But we will now give him a check. Rook e1. Now black can try to defend in different ways. If he plays bishop to e6, white has a very tricky move. Queen h5, hinting at taking the bishop on e6. For example, bishop e7, we can take this bishop. And he cannot recapture because the king is going to fall, and this is not allowed. Instead, after queen h5, black can play a move like queen d7. And now I'll suggest a very surprising move, simply taking this knight. If he will take with the c-pawn, we have knight d2, aiming to attack these pawns in the center, and white is doing better here. Instead, black can also try to take queen takes d5. We will take back on d5, pawn takes, and play knight d2. And we just need to play the knight to b3 and put more pressure on the d4 pawn, and white will be a pawn up. So this was my recommendation against bishop e6. Black can also try a move like bishop e7. Then we'll play bishop to g5, aiming to trade these bishops. Black will castle, and we will take on e7. He will take back, and we play knight d2. And at first glance, it might look like black is doing okay here, but he's not. The main reason being that our bishop on c4 is much stronger than the bishop on c8. He cannot now develop the bishop here because we will simply take a pawn. Like this, rook takes e6, white being a pawn up. For this reason, when white's knight goes to f3, for example, later, also the pawn on d4 is under pressure. And in general, white is having some trouble because the pawn on d4 is pushed a bit too far. He would love to push the pawn back to d5, but as we know, this is not allowed in chess. So this was actually my recommendation against c6. Black also has played the move bishop c5 here. And here white can play actually different ways. The strongest being to push the bishop back to c4. Also d3 is fine. In general, white is doing better here, but bishop c4 is even more nice, because if now black wants to develop the knight to f6, we can play e5 and the knight is threatened. And you might think now black can play d5, but here it's not the same, because after taking the knight, taking the pawn, the bishop, sorry, we will take on g7, rook g8. We can play the move queen h5, hitting the pawn on h7, hitting the bishop on c5, and we have a very strong pawn on g7 as well. So knight f6 is not possible. Another move which is not great is knight e7, because then we can take the pawn on f7, king takes f7, queen h5 check, hitting the king, hitting the bishop, and black is in trouble. For this reason, black can now not develop the knight, and this makes it harder for him to castle the king. Black has also tried a fancy move like queen h4. Even Richard Rapport played this move, but after pawn to d3, the queen is not standing so well, and white is simply much better because of the pawn on d4 is blocking his own bishop on c5. Another way for black to play is to play d6, and here we will simply play d3, and again the double pawn on d4 and d6 is causing black trouble. So I would not be so scared of this knight d4 move if you simply know that you should take, castle the king, and after bishop c5, bishop c4, and white is doing great here. I want to show you a last line, probably the most popular line we've showed today, to play pawn f5. And this is quite an advanced gambit called the Yanish gambit. And this is actually played by a lot of grandmasters. It's not such a weak move. And I would actually recommend not to take the pawn, but instead to push pawn d3. Simply being ready after f takes e4 to recapture the pawn. Black has also the option of playing pawn to d6 here. Now, maybe a bit surprising, it's even better for us to take, because after bishop takes f5, we can now push d4. If black takes this pawn, we can now castle. The next move we can play knight takes d4 or rook e1 check, posing problems to black's king in the center. And if black plays e4, he's actually losing after pawn to d5, which might be a bit surprising because you might think, okay, black can now take our knight. That's true, but we can also take his knight. And the next move, if black takes back on c6, we will take the bishop, and we can take the rook, we can take back the pawn, and white is winning here. Another way for black to play is a move like a6, but then we can again take the knight. He will take our bishop. Note that if he takes our knight here, we can take on b7 with a check, and next move we can take the rook on a8. So after d takes c6, black can take the bishop, and we will play knight d4, hitting the bishop, threatening to take on b7, and white is doing excellent here. For this reason, d6 is not recommended because of takes and d4. Instead, a lot of black players have tried to take on e4. White will simply recapture, and black plays knight f6, developing the knight. Black would really like to get the king castled so he can make use of the open f file for his rook, but we will not allow this to happen. We will now castle our king, and you should not be scared of him taking this pawn on e4, because after queen to e2, when he moves the knight, for example knight f6, we can simply take knight takes e5 with a great game. Or if he plays a move like d5, protecting the knight on e4, again we can take knight takes e4, because the king is pinned, the bishop on b5 is controlling the game. So after castling, black also has another option of playing a move like d6, and then I would recommend to play bishop c4. Another option is to play knight c3, also white is doing better here. But after bishop c4, again black cannot take this pawn, because if queen goes to d5, hitting the knight on e4 and threatening queen f7 checkmate. So this doesn't work for black. Instead, there might have been some games with bishop to g4, creating a pin on the knight. We can now play h3. If he takes, we will take back. We have a very strong bishop here, doing great. If he goes bishop h5, we can play knight c3. And if he plays a move like knight d5, intending to double our pawns, now is the time to push g4. And if he takes here, hoping for something like takes and bishop takes, pinning our knight, we can take first here on d4, and the next move we're threatening to take on g4. And white is simply doing excellent here. So this was d6. I have to note that most black players probably will play bishop to c5, as this is the main line. And now we will take this knight. We are going to be very greedy right now, but sometimes greed is good in chess. If he takes the d pawn, this is not really acceptable for him, because queen takes d8, king takes d8, knight takes e5, and we're threatening knight f7 with a winning position. Instead, most black players have taken b takes c6. Now we can grab this pawn on e5. Black cannot grab our pawn on e4 because we have the move queen h5 check. If he moves the king, for example, to f8, we have a mate on f7. So this doesn't work for black. The same being if he plays king e7, we can play queen f7 check. King goes here, and knight c4, again checkmating the black king. After queen h5, you might think, okay, black can simply block with pawn to g6, but it's not so easy, because then white can take knight takes g6. If black takes back, we will take the rook on h8 with a winning position. And black is in a big trouble, because if he cannot take this knight, white will simply move the knight later, and he will again be in a lot of checks from the white queen. After knight takes e5, most black players have castled the king, finally getting into safety. But now we will play knight to c3, defending the pawn on e4. And here it doesn't look like black has enough compensation. I have looked a bit at some different lines, but everywhere it looks like it's not enough. For example, after pawn d6, white has the option to play knight a4, hitting the bishop on c5. Another option for white is to play knight to d3, also better for white. The same after rook goes to e8, we will again go knight d3, hitting the bishop on c5 and being a pawn up. And the same after bishop a6, we will also play knight d3. In all lines, it looks like white is simply doing better and black is struggling to keep equality. So now we looked at some different sidelines in the Spanish. We looked at d6, after which d4 is the way to go, putting pressure on the black center. After bishop c5, we want to play c3, intending at some point to push d4 and knight f6, castling, and next move white will play d4. Note in many lines that we will actually give up this e4 pawn, because if black takes the pawn, like here, after d4, he will be in a grave danger. He doesn't have time to do this. So this was bishop c5. Also we looked at knight d4, where you should simply take it and double his pawns. And f5, we don't want to go into black's plan of taking the pawn, so we will simply play pawn to d3, defending the pawn on e4, and enjoying a good game. So thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope it has been useful, and I think I might make another one covering the last few sidelines, and after that you will have a full repertoire to play for white in the Spanish. So thank you and see you around.